trying to like push myself. I was trying to push myself through this barrier, just build more muscle, build more muscle. But like you, I also noticed that I was gaining a little bit more fat. And like you, I was like, maybe I need to rethink this whole regimen, right? Carbs included, right? Because it's not just a branched chain amino acid problem. I want to make a couple comments on what you just said. So this whole, let me first start on the cholesterol debate, and then I just want to talk a little briefly about this whole fat thing that you were talking about. So I want to say that they're not related, right? So fat intake is not related necessarily to cholesterol, okay, directly. And I'll tell you why in just a second, but so the cholesterol thing is very interesting. There's like, there's advanced cholesterol tests that look beyond just LDL and HDL, right? There's like these apoprotein tests, there's NMR cholesterols, and they basically subdivide the LDL fraction and see, well, do you have the ones that are really small and create a lot of problems? Do you have the ones that are kind of small but don't create problems, right? A lot of that obviously is genetic, but the other part of that, another part of the genetic side of things is obviously your gut microbiome. Most of your genes are not your own. Most of your genes are actually coming from your gut. And so the interesting thing is that almost like 90 to 95% of your cholesterol in your blood, guess what, is not coming from what you're eating. It's coming from recirculation of bile, right? So bile gets excreted from your liver and it goes into your small intestine and it basically digests fats. And then there's a deconjugation enzyme process that happens as a result of the gut microbiome, right? And then it gets reabsorbed in the later part of your intestine. So this bile circulation pathway is what's responsible for 90% of your cholesterol, right?
Interesting.
Obviously, being on a hypercaloric diet or being on a high sugar diet or not exercising, for example, can impact those variables, right? I'm not saying that they don't. There's even probiotics that you can take that allow you to excrete more bile because the bacteria that are in these probiotics, for example, they allow for a more favorable deconjugation of bile so that you excrete it, right, instead of taking it up. Now, that's like the picture of cholesterol. Like cholesterol is a multivariable thing. It's not even your own genetics. There's also these bacterial and viral genomes inside your microbiome. And then there's this whole like bile, plus you have like, issues with sugar, protein, caloric intake that also impact this. So has very little to do with fat intake. Now, I do believe there's, animal-based cholesterol that does impact it, right? But it's one of the variables, right? It's one of like 10 variables that we've identified. Okay. So
Mm.
now, you bring up another point, right? You got a family history potentially of stroke or, people worried about heart attacks, right? Does high cholesterol necessarily mean you're going to get a heart attack? Does high cholesterol necessarily mean you're going to get stroke? Does it mean you're going to get atherosclerosis? And the answer is not necessarily, right? So there are people with normal cholesterols that get heart attacks. There are people with high cholesterols that don't get heart attacks. There are
Right.
people that, get strokes and they don't have anything wrong with them, right? And
Yeah.
so that
And
whole idea of
my father's stroke was very clearly from having high blood pressure for many years and
correct.
refusing to go to a doctor because he just doesn't go to doctors and
Mhm.
not taking medications and then having an event that triggered him and got him really angry and then having the stroke after that. So I think blood pressure is definitely a very important marker to that we need to be aware of as well. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
I
that I
think
think
blood.
is more of an internal thing, right? How can you calm yourself and relax yourself and not take things personally or get angry? I mean, more than anything, I think blood pressure is related more to that than anything else, personally.
Yeah, there's a lot of, so as you know, the higher the blood pressure in certain, if your blood vessels are getting assaulted with this high pressure system, they become
Mm,
thickened naturally, right?
mm.
And so then the question becomes, well, is it getting thickened too fast and can they cause things like stroke and things like that? And the answer is a resounding yes. It also means your heart has to work harder, things like that. So um, so that being said, I think, these types of atherosclerotic processes, like you said, have to do with inflammation, and with inflammation, you have 5 variables that affect inflammation: diet, digestion, sleep, stress, exercise. So all of these things matter. Genetics plays a role. Gut microbiome plays probably an even bigger role in it. And you're right. You're absolutely right. And so that's like the whole cholesterol conversation, right? it's
Yeah.
not as clean as you may think. It's also not, the answer is not always statins, because statins, as you know, have like a 30% side effect rate. So it's not like you just take a statin and things go away. It's just like there's a whole different set of problems that come with statins, right?
Yeah.
Ideal situation is you figure out a way to do it just based on your lifestyle, which, to be honest with you, most people that are following like a pretty comprehensive and well thought out nutrition plan and exercise plan, they can bring down their cholesterol even if they have bad genetics. Okay. Even if they have bad genetics, they can bring down their cholesterol to normal numbers. Okay.
Hmm.
So that's an interesting thing, right? That like even despite this, the deck being stacked against you genetically, you can still find ways to get down to a not dangerous number, right?
Yeah.
And we don't know what that number is for everyone. There's just these arbitrary numbers that people throw around, but and there are other tests you can check to see if you have atherosclerotic disease. Now, okay, so that's the cholesterol side of things.
Hmm.
Now the fat side of things, right? Whole debate, right? Whole debate on saturated fats, unsaturated fats. There's even some debate. Like I got into this conversation, a few people with like the omega-6, like some people believe it's pro-inflammatory, anti-inflammatory. Um, the comment I'll make about the fat is fat has historically, like in our as humans, right? It's been our primary energy source, right? Back when we were hunter gatherers, we weren't eating a bunch of carbs, right, to get our nutrition. We were actually eating fatty meat. And so there's this concept going around that like, hey, we should just live like the cavemen, right? But the cavemen only lived till like 40 years old. Okay. So it's not, there's like we don't really know. There's not a lot of like, it's hard to know what you should follow. Like I get a lot of comments in my, on my channel, like, oh, hey, why don't you advocate for a carnivore diet? And the only benefits like of carnivore is that it's low glycemic and you're avoiding sugar. It's not that you're eating a bunch of healthy stuff. Actually, all the data, all the longevity studies from around the world, the people that eat the least meat actually live the longest, which is crazy, right? All the data is showing that. So clearly there's some like, it's somewhere in the middle, right? Like
Yeah.
you can't be like avoiding meat and eating sugar or eating a bunch of carbs, because in those same societies that live a long time, they're not eating processed carbs. They're not eating a bunch of like all this junk either, right? And the meat
Yeah.
that they eat tends to be wild caught. It tends to be locally raised. You understand what I'm trying to say here? So
Yeah.
there's a lot
Yeah.
of variables here that like matter, but
Yeah, it's a whole different discussion. Like when people are just like, meat is bad. I'm like, are you talking about
yeah,
meat from McDonald's, or are you talking about grass-fed, grass-finished meat,
exactly,
right? Like it's not
exactly.
even, and that's the whole thing where, when vegans are like, oh, well, meat is bad and there's studies that prove it. It's like, well, were the studies done on people who ate grass-fed, grass-finished meat? And what was the rest
Right.
of their diet like? Were they eating
Were
French fries with the meat too? You
were
know,
they exercising,
were they, yeah,
right?
exactly.
Because exercise
Hmm.
has a lot to do with how you process branched chain amino acids, for example,
Mm. Hmm.
right? So
Hmm.
if you're not exercising and you're eating an excessive amount of branched chain amino acids, then you will get insulin resistance. Like bottom line, it will also drive up your insulin like growth factor, which actually decreases longevity, right? So if you're eating all these things and you're not doing exercise, yeah, it's a problem. You can also get the same problems from sugar, right? Or excessive carbohydrates. And then here's the other thing. Guess what? When you're exercising, you want there to be a little bit of arachidonic acid so that you build muscle, right? And arachidonic acid, it comes from like the cholesterol and the fat portion of the meat. So here's another example of like, the context of how and when you're consuming it also matters, right? So if you're just eating a bunch of this food thinking you're healthy, but then like you're basically sedentary, then you have higher inflammation in your body as a result of it. And then all of that like cholesterol that's coming in the meat, all the fat that's coming in the meat, guess what? You pair that with high inflammation, and what does that cause? High cholesterol, it causes inflammation, it actually causes atherosclerosis, and it causes shorter lifespans, right? It's
Yeah.
exactly what you said, right? There's no way to really look at all of these variables in a study because there's so many variables to optimize in a situation like this.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. And I think, on the carnivore and also keto, they've shown like if I was a diabetic, I would for sure either do carnivore or keto, like
Correct. Yeah.
hardcore. And I mean, there's been tons of studies showing that carnivore and keto have both literally reversed diabetes in many people. So if anyone has pre-diabetes or diabetes, it would be the first thing, that I would do. And I was funny because I spoke with someone, her husband was diabetic, and I said something. No, I said something, mentioned something about, oh, have you tried the keto diet? She's like, no. She's like, vegan diet. I'm doing the vegan, and it was like, well, okay. And then it's like he's eating tons of carbs and all this stuff, and I'm just like,
That's the problem,
oof,
right?
that's
Yeah.
horrible. Yeah,
So
yeah.
I've reversed diabetes in a ton of my patients on sort
Mm,
of like on mixed diets. So it's like a phytonutrient specific diet. So it's not carnivore, but my phytonutrient diet happens to be low glycemic. Okay, so it's not there's no secret, right? Like this is why Weight Watchers works for diabetes. This is why anything low carb works for diabetes. It doesn't have to be meat. It just, people that are on that carnivore paleo lifestyle, it happens to also be low carb. So it's hard to separate it out, right? It's hard to know, like, are the benefits actually coming from the meat itself or versus the carbs being so low? Because the answer is probably on the carb side of things and the meat side of things. Because as you know, plenty of different ways to get protein, right? So
yeah.
um, it's just interesting to think about.
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely very interesting to think about. I mean, for me, I've always said like health is about lowering inflammation in the body, right? And just to touch on what you said real quick, also with exercise, it's like there is hands down, there's nothing better for increasing your lifespan, for fighting depression, for making you feel better, have giving you more energy. There's nothing better than exercise. Obviously, weight training to build strength is a part of that for men and women. But
Yeah.
also, there's a lot of talk recently about literally how zone two, literally just going on walks for 40 minutes a day, every day. Most people could lose a tremendous amount of weight and improve their health dramatically just by walking 40 minutes a day. People who don't even
I
exercise,
would
right? And
totally agree with that. I was checking my steps one day on my phone,
mm-hmm.
and I would kid myself and say, I walk around a lot, rounding in hospitals, seeing patients, and on the days that I'm out, doing all that, yeah, my steps are high, but on the days that I'm just operating or not doing that, I mean, my steps can be as low as two to 3,000, which is like that is sedentary. That is sedentary. That's
Mm-hmm.
the equivalent of smoking cigarettes, basically, right?
Yeah,
For your
yeah,
health, right? And so on those days, it becomes very important for, unfortunately, most people, a lot of people don't have a lot of activity at work. And so they need to get that some other way, which means, walking at baseline, right? Walking is a great way, right? And
yeah,
then
yeah.
you
And
can
zone
integrate
two, they
other
say,
things.
is basically like, walking at a fast pace, right? Fast enough where you could have a conversation, but it would be difficult for you to have a conversation, right? So walking at a fast pace, something like that. I mean, that alone could have huge benefits for people.
Mhm.
But for me, again, I think about health as like I've always said, health is about lowering inflammation in the body. Pretty much every disease comes from inflammation. I say all the time that I think most people that have shoulder pain, back pain, knee pain, unless it's some acute injury that they got in a car accident or something like that, right? Like if it's chronic long-term pain, most of the time it's inflammation. And again, I had the inflammation in my arms and I thought, oh, it's carpal tunnel, oh, it's arthritis, it's cubital tunnel, it's tennis elbow. Every day on the internet, I had a new diagnosis for myself there. And it came down to just being inflammation in the body. And
Yeah.
so for me, it is probably why I still like to keep a little bit of a more of a lower carb diet. Plus, I just
Mhm.
feel better. I don't, I can't imagine. Is there anyone who ever just like ate a huge bowl of pasta and said, "Oh, I feel amazing now. I'm gonna go." I feel super energetic and amazing right now. Like I can't picture it. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe after a super hard workout or something. Like my daughter plays a crazy long soccer game or something, and then she'll down a whole bowl of pasta or whatever, and she's totally fine. But kids, I think, are a totally different story. But so I wanted to kind of ask you about I mean, are you still doing this 200 something grams of carbs per day? Do you think the carb, like, what's your, what's your opinion on carbs and higher carb and how it could cause inflammation potentially, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, the answer is once I got these labs back, I was like kind of a little spooked about everything, right? Because obviously I gained a lot of muscle. There's value in that. But ultimately, overall health matters a lot, right? So then you have to kind of reprioritize things. And so obviously, yes, I'm eating less carbs. I'm also eating fewer branched chain amino acids if I'm not like right in the acute workout period, right? So
And when you say you're
this,
eating fewer branched chain amino acids, just so people understand, does that just mean protein in general? Like,
well, so no, yeah. Let me back up. So I was, one of the things I've spoken about has been the issue with casein, which is a type of protein in whey concentrate. And casein, turns out, some people have an immunogenic reaction to the casein. Casein comes in two forms, A1 and A2. A1 tends to be more immunogenic. That's why you see these A2 milks being promoted now.
mhm.
But there's some immunogenicity that is associated with casein. It's we see it in a lot of autoimmune diseases. We see it in a lot of people with inflammation, but not everyone, right? We don't know what that percentage number is. We just know that that is a problem that we see quite frequently. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times, just given that that is an issue, and when you're talking about milk products, right, you also have the problem with lactose, right? So you have a problem with lactose, you have a problem with casein. Well, what does that leave you? Well, you can get something called whey protein isolate. And whey isolate is interesting because you don't have the same immunogenic issues as casein, and it's like the highest amount of branched chain amino acids you can possibly get. It actually helps build muscle pretty fast. It turns out, like I was reading a few articles recently because I was trying to figure out like why is my A1C creeping up? Why is my cholesterol creeping up? And it turns out that the whey releases into the bloodstream within about 20 minutes, right? It's different than whey concentrate. Whey concentrate has casein plus whey isolate. I'm talking about whey isolate here, right? So whey isolate releases into the bloodstream in about 20 minutes. So if you're taking these massive shakes that are, I'm talking in excess of 30 grams. So you're doing like 50, 60, like 75, 100-gram shakes. And if you're doing it, and if you're just chugging that shake, let's just say you're taking it all, most of that will just convert into pyruvate, which is a sugar derivative, right? It's basically half of a sugar, and it drives up insulin levels independent of anything. It doesn't do anything for your muscle. So trying to like push myself, I was trying to push myself through this barrier, just build more muscle, build more muscle. But like you, I also noticed that I was gaining a little bit more fat. And like you, I was like, maybe I need to rethink this whole regimen, right? Carbs included, right? Because it's not just a branched chain amino acid problem. So I switched my protein intake to a more balanced intake. So post workout, I will still do branched chain amino acids. Okay. I will time them out so that I'm not doing more than, like, if I'm doing a whey isolate, then really the sweet spot's around 30 an hour. Okay. With carbs. Okay. And then if I'm not doing a whey isolate, let's say I'm doing a pea protein or a plant-based protein, which I love plant-based proteins because they're a little bit longer acting, right? They're not like whey isolate. They act more like casein, where they'll release over 3 to 4 or 5 hours. You don't have the same insulin spikes with those sorts of things because they release over time. Though, and then I will pair that also towards the end of that 4-hour window. So I've just noticed, and I've only been doing this probably last 6 months or so, and the only thing I've noticed is I've lost fat, and I'm still doing the same thing in the gym. So I'm clearly, you're going to lose a little bit of muscle doing that. It's not just a freebie, but in terms of like gains, I haven't really noticed much difference in terms of my muscle, my abilities at the gym. So I've just noticed less fat, which is great. And I bet you if I were to check, and obviously I've dropped down the carbs to where I'm intaking carbs in and around my workout time. Other than that, I'm kind of keeping it to a minimum, right? I'm getting a lot of fat calories as well. So, and my fat calories don't come from saturated fat. My fat calories come from monounsaturated phyto oils, right? So we're talking the omega 3, 6, 7, and 9, right? And these phyto oils, a lot of them come from plant-based sources, but you can also get them from things like fish, for example, or grass-fed meats, right?
Yeah,
So,
so everyone knows, I think omega-3 is basically like fish oil, which I supplement with myself and am a big fan of, and I do also eat a decent amount of fish. And then you have, obviously, we all know the health benefits of olive oil, right, and the monounsaturated, right?
yeah, and that's an
Um,
omega 9, by the way. Olive oil is a
omega.
monounsaturated omega 9.
That's right. Forgot about that. Forgot that you also call that omega 9. That's right. Yeah. But the omega 6 now is probably the more controversial one,
Correct.
where, again, because the seed oils, right? And where people are looking at canola oil and sunflower, safflower, vegetable oil, corn oil, soybean, all those oils that have been kind of widely known now as not being healthy. Would you agree with that on those ones?
Yeah, I mean, it's more. Yes, I do overall. But there's a subtle point to be made, and that the point I'm gonna try to draw out is this omega 6 is a very important topic because I think a lot of people are either on one side of this debate or the other, but they're not really talking about the same thing. So, like, some people say omega 6 are pro-inflammatory. Some people say omega 6 is anti-inflammatory, right? But I think the debate is they're talking about two different types of omega 6. Okay. And I mentioned this to you at lunch the other day, right? The word omega just means that there's a double bond in the carbon at the sixth carbon. That's why it's an omega 6, right?
Hmm.
Sometimes you can get a cis isomer or a trans isomer, and the cis isomers are healthy. The trans isomers, they're trans fats. So you can have omega 6 trans fats, which are bad for you, right? You can also get that from heating an oil. Like, for example, let's say you're heating an olive oil or you're heating like something that has a lot of omega fat in it. The heating process can turn it into a trans fat. Anything
Mm.
above like 160 to 180 degrees is usually, you don't even have to get to the smoke point. You could just get it at 160 to 180 degrees. And so, with specifically discussing the omega 6, there's a type of omega 6 that's really, really good for you. It's really healthy for you. And it's called gamma linoleic acid. Linoleic acid, gamma linoleic acid, also known as GLA.
Hmm.
GLA, if you type it into PubMed or whatever, like you do your internet search, you'll see article after article after article talking about how beneficial it is for a lot of conditions. It's great for neuropathic pain. It's great for breast cysts. It's great for, just a lot of things. Okay. Because it's an anti-inflammatory omega 6, right? But with that, you can also get pro-inflammatory omega 6s too, and it's important to differentiate. Like, for example, you can put like there's an article, I forget where it's from, but if you look at grass-fed meat, for example, right? If you look at the portion of its omega 6 that's gamma linoleic acid, it's higher than regularly grown meat. So here, if you're thinking like, hey, I'm going to eat meat,
Mm.
it might have some fat that's unhealthy for me, right? If it's grass fed, grass finished, guess what? More of that omega 6 fraction will be gamma linoleic acid, and you'll get more of the health benefits.
Mm.
And
Hmm.
so you see gamma linoleic acid in a lot of plant-based omega acids and things. So that's the debate, right? Everybody's just trying to lump one thing or not. Like, people are saying, they're trying to say no, omega 6 is good, omega 6 is bad, and really what they're talking about is two different. They're talking about two different things, and
Mm.
people don't dive into this issue. They don't like try to look this stuff up. And by the way, everything I'm saying here, just Google it. Just look it up. Like, there's actually a ton of data, and actually I write about this in my book, the Phyto Diet Primer. I tell people, I say, hey, look at whether it's a cis versus trans isomer on these omega acids, and you'll figure out that the gamma linoleic acid, the cis isomer, is actually healthy. And turns out
Where do
all
you
the
so
omega. Oh,
other
go
than
for it.
grass fed? I know we got to wrap in a second, but other than
Sure.
grass fed, grass finished beef, what are other sources of GLA? That
Nuts.
nuts. Got
Nuts
it.
are a
Yep.
great source, right? Nuts.
I'm a big nut
Avocados
guy.
are a great source. Actually, most gamma linoleic acid comes from plants. And the only
Hmm.
reason the only reason grass-fed beef has more GLAs is because they're eating grass. That's why.
Right.
That's
Right.
why it's healthier, right? And
Right.
so it's actually a phyto oil. It's one of the 8 key phytonutrients that I'm always preaching about, right? Like another example is, fish oil is an omega 3, right?
Hmm.
And it's healthy, and because it's a cis omega 3. Well, did you know most omega 3s don't even come from fish? They come from plants, right? So
Like
you get
algae.
omega
Right.
3s
Yeah.
called alpha lipoic acid, ALA, right?
Hmm.
That's
Hmm.
also a cis omega 3 fatty acid, right?
Oh, it
The
is.
one
ALA is. Oh, nice.
Yeah, ALA is a cis omega fatty acid. You get it in walnuts. You get it in a ton of different, like, nuts and things. Another example, we just talked about olive oil. It's a cis omega 9 fatty acid called oleic acid, right? And so this is a really interesting topic because, we just got done talking about saturated versus unsaturated. And really the answer is monounsaturated omega fats are what most of your fats should be. That's the answer,
Right.
right? That's the answer.
Yep, exactly. Exactly. Well, man, this has been awesome once again, and I know we're going to do it again soon. I know we got both of us have some travels coming up, but I'm sure
Yeah.
we'll be right back at it as soon as we get back. But man, always a pleasure, and really loving this new format. And we have so much more to cover, in future episodes. So look forward to doing it again with you here soon.
Talor, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for listening, and just a reminder, if you haven't yet tried any of our Peak Performance products, you get 20% off your first order. We have one of the largest selection of USDA certified organic superfood powders, as well as very high quality supplements, and you get 20% off your first order at buypeakperformance.com. That's www.buypeakperformance.com.